Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is completely given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, release stories, production stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're certainly films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, the fact that films get made, that they're really difficult to make, and that I'm really glad that they do get made. Without further ado, I'm going to just get on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. We've got a couple of sequels for you this time. The first of them is a comic book movie, a bit rare for me, but I'm going back to 2007, and as always, I'll start with a clip. The story comes the other side of this.
As you may know, there have been unusual occurrences all over the world.
These were taken by one of our spy satellites 3 days ago.
We need a way to locate and intercept that object.
What is it?
We were hoping you could tell us.
It's here.
That's bad.
That's really bad.
We have to destroy this thing.
Your encounter with a surfer has affected your molecules. It could cause you to temporarily switch powers.
You like volunteer?
That then was a clip from the trailer from 2017's Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, directed by Tim Story from a screenplay by Don Payne and Mark Frost, story by John Turman and Mark Frost, and based, of course, on Fantastic Four, the comic books from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Cast for this one led by Joanne Griffith, Jessica Alba, Chris Evans, Michael Chiklis, Julian McMahon, Kerry Washington, Andre Braugher, Bo Garrett, Doug Jones and Lawrence Fishburne on voicing duties as well. And I mean, the film arrived in 2007 when comic book movies were in a little bit of flux, that we'd seen the Spider-Man films at the start of the decade go pretty much nuclear and open up a box office fault that people were desperately trying to capitalise on. 20th Century Fox was one of the studios that managed to do so with its certainly with its first three X-Men films, but Fox had struggled with other movies that it tried to get up and running, that it had rights to certain Marvel characters and thus had done films about Daredevil, which had done okay, not critically well received, but did enough box office business. Its spin-off movie from Daredevil, Elektra, well, that had struggled, and 2005's Fantastic Four movie, well, that had felt a little bit tame too. So Fantastic Four was a big deal, bringing them to the screen. Hugely popular Marvel characters, Marvel's first family as they're known. And so, I mean, this was something. This was going to be a big deal. Tim Story came in to direct the film, and it was a very PG-rated, fairly bland piece of cinema. I'm not wrong with that, and it was a bland piece of cinema that did over $300 million at the global box office, at a point where that was still considered good money, but still there was a feeling that there was something better in the midst of this. However, the origin story's done, so why not crack on with the next film? And as such, 20th Century Fox was soon keen to try again. A sequel with the same team behind was looking to green light it. Fantastic Four 2, as it was originally known, thus got the official yes of 20th Century Fox in December of 2005. Now, this was 5 months after the cinema release of the original film, and the original had done enough at the cinema, but also it was on its way at the time to becoming one of Fox's most successful DVD releases of all time. And so in 2005, this was still a thing. You could prop up the box office performance of your movie with a big selling DVD. Look at the American Pie franchise and how much was made out of all the straight to DVD sequels for that. And in the case of Fantastic Four, it was a big seller. Fox wanted another, but also it wanted another quickly. Now, everyone knew the game here. They knew that it was likely to be coming. The core cast had signed up for 3 movies apiece. But once Fox said yes, there was now going to be 18 months to get the film written, filmed and released. And that was going to prove to be a hell of a schedule, really. So it was in December 2005 that director Tim Story agreed his deal to return and direct the second movie. He did so walking into it knowing that it was going to be a tight schedule, but also he'd had a hell of a tight schedule on the first film. It's pretty well known that the first Fantastic Four film went through the hands of several directors, including the likes of Home Alone director Chris Columbus. And in fact, Tim Story joined the movie just over a year before its release. So that was very much a race to the finish line to try and get that one finished. And the fact that he was going to get 18 months this time, well, it must have felt like a bit of a luxury. Story also was very open-eyed about how the first movie had gone down. There's quite a remarkable set visit piece in Empire magazine that came out just ahead of the release of Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer in cinemas, because there was some quite open criticism, really. I mean, Tim Story, talking of the first film, said we were getting a pretty good whipping at first, but also he was confident that things they were looking to introduce in the second film would win elements of fandom over who hadn't been overly charmed by the first. I mean, he said all the he's saying all the right things. We also want to take it to the next level in terms of tightness, of the storytelling, of the powers, and just go to different places with it. And so Story signed a deal that made him 3 times as much money as the first film. Variety, which reported this, wasn't giving the exact numbers away. Short of, we learned that Tim Story got a 6-figure salary for the first Fantastic Four movie. He got a 7-figure salary for the second. And at the same time he signed his deal for Fantastic Four 2, he picked up a couple of commissions from Fox TV as well. And so all of a sudden he had 2 or 3 projects on the go, but the Fantastic Four sequel was the top priority of them. So still in December 2005, small matter of, you know what we could use? Could use a script. That's a good idea. And so it became clear that Don Payne was going to write a screenplay for this one, and Mark Frost as well. So let's dig into that a little bit, because Mark Frost was confirmed to be writing the script in December of 2015. Then we learnt that Payne was as well, but it didn't look like the pair were necessarily working together. It looked from the outside looking in that Fox had done that thing of getting 2 writers to come up with different screenplays, and then it was going to kind of pick the one that it liked the best. So what we were also learning during this development period, and the writing was coming together quickly, was that Fox was finally going to bring the Silver Surfer to the screen as a main character in one of its movies. Now, Fox had, as I mentioned before, been trying to get a Fantastic Four film going for a long time, but also it had been trying to get a Silver Surfer movie going. Once it hit pay dirt with its first X-Men film, it realised that comic book movies were a way forward. I mean, it got there ahead of most, really, that you could make them for less than $100 million. You didn't have to pay a movie star. You just had to spend on getting the right characters, the right effects, ideally making the film good, but that's not always been a core consideration, really. And so Silver Surfer was one of those projects it was trying to get going. And by March of 2006, when it became known that Silver Surfer was going to be a big part of the Fantastic Four sequel, A, fans were pleased, and B, it was Don Payne's script that seemed to have moved into the lead. Now, Fox had some caution over the Silver Surfer character, and that was related to the fact that if it introduced the character as a support in a Fantastic Four movie, would that take away from its still future plans to have a standalone film based entirely around the Silver Surfer character? But also, it'd take nearly 10 years to get this far, and so it got to the point where it was just like, this might be the best way to do it. Now, Don Payne was a busy man working through all of this because he didn't just have his eye on one film, he was looking towards the next 2 or 3. And so he introduced a major foe from the world of the comic books who's linked to Silver Surfer stories, Galactus, a planet-swallowing villain of great villainy and dastardly and, well, planet-swallowing, really. And the idea was to build towards a 3rd film that would really bring Galactus right into the centre of it, assuming Fox wanted a 3rd film. It was not an unnatural assumption that it would do, notwithstanding the fact that it had signed people up to 3 picture contracts. It was turning this Fantastic Four film round in 2 years. It knew there were lots of other comic book movies, in production and on the way, that it knew that there was a new Batman film coming. It knew that Marvel Studios was going to have a go at getting the rights back to its own movies and see where it could go there. And so it wanted to make sure if not necessarily ahead of the curve, certainly competitive when it came to its comic book films, not least because the original run of X-Men films that it had planned, well, that trilogy had closed out at this point. Still, Tim Story knew that he really had to deliver with the next film. And as he would explain, he said, we got a new character coming to the scene, the Silver Surfer, who is one of the coolest comic book characters of all time. And that's not just Story's view either. This was a pretty well-held view. And he said, we've upped the ante. I mean, he's, again, saying all the right things, bigger stunts, more action, more CGI characters and situations. These were all the selling points. And Don Payne said, I mean, he wanted this to be the kind of sequel that actually improves on the original. He said, I really wanted to explore where the characters are at this point in their lives. They'd been established in the first film, and Payne argued they're much better off financially, but they're dealing with the downside of celebrity. The characters of Sue and Reed are moving on and trying to get married, and the plan was we're going to put a big wedding at the heart of the film. Ben and Alicia are enjoying being a happy couple. Johnny's got his own issues. And Payne said there are exciting things happening with the characters and relationships, but most of all, I'm excited about the dimension added by the Silver Surfer. And one subtle, well, not so subtle as it turned out, thing that this brought in was it moved the Fantastic Four movies away from New York City, where the first one had been set. It was a threat against New York in the first film, to this was now going to be a global threat, not least because here's a baddie that likes eating planets. And I think we could roughly assume that that would cause some global peril. In terms of new characters outside of the Silver Surfer, there weren't actually that many. And there was talk of introducing the character Nick Fury into this. Nick Fury has gone on to be played by Samuel L. Jackson in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but could have debuted in contemporary big screen blockbuster cinema here. A late change moved that to the character General Haya instead, and it was Andre Braugher who signed on to that role in August of 2006, famously rejecting a supporting role in the television juggernaut at the time, ER, so he could appear in the Fantastic Four film. And with the script in place, Tim Story in place, and the cast all returning, filming could begin on this one in August 2006. Now that is just 9 months after the green light had been given, when the two competing scripts were being put together. But also a lot of the infrastructure was in place. They'd been making comic book movies, Fox had for some time, and it had been basing them in and around the Vancouver area in Canada. And so the production offices for Fantastic Four 2 were duly sited at Vancouver Film Studios, and it brought back a lot of the behind-the-scenes crew who'd made the first Fantastic Four film and the 3 X-Men films to that point. And the idea was bring that expertise in, but also the new Fantastic Four film was going to ramp things up a lot. It was going to be more expensive than the first film. It was going to have a lot more to it than the first film. And I mean, if you look at the 2005 movie, that was done on a budget of about $85-90 million. Here, the price was going up. The demands on effects were going up, and it was going to have a massive CG character at the heart of it as well. So just because it was based in Vancouver, there was still a lot of exterior work. And in fact, there was a lot of second unit work on this one. I read 40 days of second unit photography alone on the Fantastic Four sequel. And that second unit would go and shoot lots of establishing and exterior stuff around the world. They went to Shanghai, they went back to New York, they came to London as well. But a lot of it was done on stage, on stages at Vancouver Film Studios. They also took over stages stages at Mammoth Studios in the suburbs of Vancouver as well. And again, it was reusing these facilities. The people knew what they were doing, and so they pressed ahead and just got this thing on rails and moving as fast as they could. Now, going back to the Empire set report, which I was chuckling as I was reading it, because having a CG character at the heart of the film wasn't necessarily to the liking of everyone, really. So Michael Chiklis, brilliant actor. I mean, the TV series The Shield was his breakthrough, and he'd landed the role of Ben the Thing Grimm in Fantastic Four off the back of it, and then found himself sat in a suit for most of it and struggling to emote through it. And even as the second Fantastic Four movie was shooting, he knew he didn't have an awful lot to do in it. I mean, he wasn't daft. He says a little bit of the thrill has gone in this one, he told Empire. He said there's moments when you come onto a huge set where you realise the scope of this and you get that childlike butterfly in your stomach. And then he countered that by saying, but when you're in the doldrums of day to day, he says, I'm supposed to be the most powerful man in the world. And when I'm wearing this, he said, gesticulating to his suit, I can barely hold a bottle of water. And the thing is, Chiklis' pain here was known because Tim Story addressed this and said, he basically admitted he knew that the character of Ben Grimm was getting short shrift in the film. And he said, if we're blessed to have a third instalment, Ben Grimm will probably have a bigger story. But then the eyes were sort of on a third instalment as well, even beyond the fact that Don Payne had been developing ideas for more of them. They knew that they were building up to Galactus. They knew that the plan was to get Galactus in a third film coming out in 2009. They were still trying to keep things under their, close to their chest. They didn't want to spoil things for fans. They wanted to hold stuff back. But again, then you come to another interview. Chris Evans, what happened to him? He says, unfortunately, with Fantastic Four, he said in the article effectively promoting the film, you sometimes feel like you're making a product. And he said, he did admit that he owed the original movie everything, but it's telling that around the same time he took on a supporting role in Danny Boyle's film Sunshine, which I covered before in a previous episode of this podcast, but his heart seemed a lot more in Sunshine than it did in Fantastic Four. Now, this is Chris Evans. He's very professional. He puts in his work, puts in his performance, so he wasn't punching down on the film he was in. But still, the whole article is hardly bristling with enthusiasm from the core performers in the movie. Still, if the core cast were having to dig deep to motivate themselves, let's just say that, one person who wasn't was Doug Jones, the brilliant Doug Jones, who was the human heart of the Silver Surfer character that we were getting on screen. And inevitably bringing the Silver Surfer to life had involved quite a lot of pre-production planning as well as on-set work and then post-production as well. And so Doug Jones, who'd just come off making Pan's Labyrinth with Guillermo del Toro, what a film and what a performance, for weeks before production and during production as well. I mean, the production leaned on Jones' training as a mime, as a contortionist. He worked with a stunt double as well, Dorian Kingi, and he worked with a movement coach on a variety of moves and working with special rigs and harnesses so that they could capture in camera the look of the Silver Surfer, so that when it went back to Weta Digital, who was in charge of the visual effects work on top of that, there would be quality reference material to work with. And so Weta as well was developing new special effects and CG processes just to add a bit more to the character as well. And it was as simple as Doug Jones providing the character and movement references. Then Scott Squires, who's the visual effects supervisor, then oversaw the process at Weta. And he was quoted as saying it was a delicate balance meeting the comics fans' expectations for the look of Galactus, for instance, and making him truly spectacular and cinematic to those not familiar with the character. Going back to the Silver Surfer, Lawrence Fishburne was hired in to lend his voice to the character. And physical production on the second Fantastic Four movie would wrap up in December 2006, leading to, quite a tight post-production period, because Fox had put this one for release in June of 2007, and outside of just the Silver Surfer, there was a lot of visual effects work that needed doing. I mean, the whole character of Galactus just 5 years earlier would have just dominated all the special effects work on the movie, but here there was a cauldron of stuff that had to be knitted together in a film that was going to have quite a tight running time as well. By the end of 2006, Fox was putting a trailer out. It was trying to build momentum and enthusiasm for the film, not least least because the competition in blockbuster cinema was going to be quite stiff in the summer of 2007. And I mean, the early signs were it was looking pretty good. I mean, Fox was clearly confident. It felt it got more fandom on its side this time, that it had the it coasted a little bit on the curiosity from fans on the first Fantastic Four movie. I mean, who wouldn't want to see Fantastic Four on the big screen? Sounds like pretty much the marketing meeting on it. But this time it knew that it had a hugely popular character with fans. It knew it didn't have to do the origin story. I mean, origin stories were coming in for a bit of a kicking at this point as well. It held back bits as well. The Fantastic Car was held back as a reveal so that there would be things in the film that weren't given away in the assorted promos. But the promos, I mean, one of the most notable was the tens of thousands of coins struck with the Silver Surfer on the back that were produced by Franklin Mint. And I mean, there was a lot of pushing and there was a lot of promoting of the film. And there was a sense that this should do more money than the original movie had done. So that first Fantastic Four film, just to put that in some degree of context and expectation level, had done $333.5 million at the global box office. And Fox was now spending, I mean, the bill came in around $130 million for the negative of the second Fantastic Four. And so Fox wanted some kind of escalation of revenue with that as well. Now, it's important to note this was not at this stage an era where comic book movies were making $1 billion routinely, but still it wanted a bit more cash. It wanted something closer to the money that Spider-Man 3 had made. What, $900 million? That was kind of the high watermark at this stage. So the build-up and the promotion was going. The cast interviews were now back on side. They were enthusiastic away from the set visit stuff. I mean, Michael Chiklis was revealing that his character Ben Grimm and he was going to have the relationship that he had with the character of Elysium Masters, that was going to be explored in greater focus in the third film. I mean, they were pushing towards that. The Jessica Alba was teasing that her character Susan Storm and Johan Griffith's character Dr. Reed Richards were going to become parents in the next film. I mean, The Incredibles from Pixar had sort of stolen the thunder of that idea a little bit, but notwithstanding, Tim Story also said he was interested in doing a third Fantastic Four movie. And do you know what? The opportunity arose. He was interested in a fourth one as well. Doug Jones, it had been reported by the autumn of 2006, had signed on to reprise the Silver Surfer in another Fantastic Four film and in a standalone movie as well. And so all that needed to happen for this to work was that Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer landed well with fans, landed well with critics, and then they could just crack on and get the third film going. What could go wrong? Well, the reviews weren't great for a start, although it's worth noting that the reviews for the second Fantastic Four film were better than the ones for the first. But still, for a 90-minute movie, it was still dragging a little bit. It was still a little bit shallow. There was a lot of spectacle. There wasn't an awful lot of substance. Surprising, given there was supposed to be a family story at the heart of it. The comparisons were still coming into what Pixar and Brad Bird had managed to do with the Incredibles movie as well. And there was sort of like a feeling, well, is that it? As much as people like seeing the Silver Surfer on the big screen, well, there was other stuff around that just seemed to be a bit more interesting, groundbreaking, ambitious. I mean, Spider-Man 3 was out that summer and was absolutely cleaning up. And that hadn't enjoyed good reviews, but, that near $900 million mark that I mentioned just before, that was kind of where Fox's eyes were. And so, I mean, to be fair to it, Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer opened the weekend of the 15th to the 17th of June in the US. It opened in first place. $58 million was the opening weekend for it. I mean, that's hardly shabby. And so the early signs, really not bad. I mean, that was roughly just a little bit above the level of the first film. And if it could keep holding that audience, maybe there'd be something there. But it started to drop. I mean, it's worth noting, it was a competitive summer. I do keep coming back to that. I mean, Shrek the Third was out that summer. That would cross 300 million at the US box office. Spider-Man 3 would cross 300 million at the US box office. Pirates of the Caribbean 3 was out. That was going to cross 300 million at the US box office. And then there were surprise hits like Knocked Up did a solid amount of money. Even Ocean's 13 cleaned up a little bit. That was around that week as well. But the competition kept coming. I mean, the following week, Evan Almighty landed. Not a great film. $31 million opening weekend. Fantastic Four lost 65% of its business. The following week after that, in came Ratatouille and the fourth Die Hard film. Fantastic Four lost another 55% of its business. And then the week after that, there's Transformers. I mean, it was a big film every week, and Fantastic Four was taking the punches and not very well. Lost another 53% of its business. And by the time Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix turned up a month after Fantastic Four's release, Fantastic Four had dropped out of the top 10 altogether. Now, it hadn't done terrible money, it should be noted. Its US gross was, $127-ish million, but still, the picture was not a happy one for Fox, that it hadn't really won over the fans. Its American box office gross in the end of $131 million, some $20 million down on the previous film. The total gross worldwide, when everything was put together, was $301 million. And so not only had Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer cost more, it had also made less as well. And it had made less in a box office environment where if you had the right film, they were going to, pretty much nuclear levels. I mean, if you look at the top grossing films of 2007, if you had the right film that year, Pirates of the Caribbean, Harry Potter, Spider-Man 3, Shrek the Third, Transformers, Ratatouille, I Am Legend, The Simpsons movie, National Treasure 2, 300, The Bourne Ultimatum, all of these films were outgrossing Fantastic Four. In fact, Fantastic Four turned out to be the 17th most popular movie at the box office globally that year. And Fox just was disappointed with how that had turned out. And on reflection, so were inevitably the creatives involved with it, because the assumption had been, had Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer took off, then the third film would have been greenlit by the end of the year, and they would be going for that 2009 release date. But it didn't happen. That as much as Tim Story had given an interview to the Los Angeles Times around the time of Silver Surfer's release, where he was talking about he wanted to bring the character of Black Panther into the movies, although Fox didn't have the rights necessarily to the character at that point. Don Payne was giving interviews talking about he wanted to bring in Marvel characters like the Inhumans, the Skrulls, Puppet Master. He wanted to bring in the Negative Zone, all of these things that just would have been fan gold. But it just hadn't worked. They'd managed to shrink their business. And Spider-Man 3 was the worst received film of the original Spider-Man trilogy, but had done the best business. Fantastic Four was regressing in the audience's eyes, and the films were getting more expensive, and Fox basically just backed away slowly from the idea of a third film. It never made a public statement saying it wasn't going to happen, but Chris Evans, for one, said in an interview not long afterwards that he felt if there was going to be a third film, he'd have heard fairly quickly, and that word hadn't been coming. And in an interview actually many years later from Joanne Griffith, he said, I sort of assumed that Fantastic Four would be a calling card, but then when it didn't take off, it didn't. His career kind of bumbled a little bit there, and it took him some time to get the footing back, but he wasn't hearing back either. Occasionally, Jessica Alba and Michael Chiklis would give an interview declaring they were open to a third movie, but it sounded in the end like it was falling on deaf ears. And I think the elephant in the room really was what happened the following year, 2008, when two comic book movies came in and just kind of redefined expectation again. Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, which broke $1 billion at the box office, and the first Iron Man film landed as well. And that's a story which I would imagine I'm sure I'll come to the first Iron Man film actually at some point in this podcast, because I think it's a really interesting story, but it changed the box office expectations of what these films could do. And Fox realised at a point where everyone else was going for kind of edgier 12A PG-13 comic book movies, here it had very sanitized PG rated ones that audiences weren't particularly liking, and this was supposed to be fan gold stuff as well. In the end, what Fox would elect to do would hit the reboot button with a very infamous 2015 new Fantastic Four film, but hecky thump, isn't that a story for another time? Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do my parish notices here. I've nearly finished the new issue of Film Stories magazine, which is going on sale shortly. You'll be able to find that at store.filmstories.co.uk, along with the new issue of Film Junior magazine as well. Thank you to everyone who supports our print magazines. We're hugely passionate about them and I love making them, and I hope you enjoy them too. If you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are 3 ways you can do so, and all of them are appreciated. If you want to support it financially and chuck us a few coins, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You find out the gossip of what's going on behind the scenes. In return, we spend that money on making the podcast, on materials for this podcast, and also we try and give new writers a paid writing break as well on our website. And so that's what all the funds go there. I'd like to tell you that they go towards my coffee and wine fund, but sadly they don't. If you can subscribe to this podcast, that really helps enormously as well. And if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that would be very much appreciated. If I've not completely bored you as well, I'm also hosting Studio Canal Presents, the podcast at the moment. We've just released a new episode of that where we're digging into the film story of the Railway Children. That's available where you can find all podcasts too. They've not paid me to say that. I just wanted to. But I'm now going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I love the story behind this one. I think it's a corker. I hope you like it too. Going back to the 1980s, I'm going to play you the full trailer at one stage that was released for this film the year before it came out. It's only just over a minute, but crikey, listen to this.
A creature alive today has survived millions of years of evolution. It lives to kill, a mindless eating machine that will attack and devour anything. One terrified you like nothing you have ever experienced when it captured your imagination and tapped your fear like no movie before it. Then, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, 2 continued the legend and spread the fear. Next summer, nature's most terrifying creature takes on an all-new dimension in an all-new adventure. And for the first time, the terror of Jaws will not stop at the edge of the screen. Jaws 3D. The 3rd dimension is terror.
Now, you can come at me with whatever you want about the film that we're going to talk about now, but you're not telling me that's not a great way to promote a film. This is 1983's Jaws 3D, directed by Joe Alves. Screenplay in the end credited to Richard Matheson and Carl Gottlieb, with a story from Gordon Trueblood, starring Dennis Quaid, Bess Armstrong, Simon McCorkindale, and Louis Gossett Jr. Leah Thompson in her first film role in this one as well. But this nearly turned out very, very different. So, brief history of the Jaws series. The first Jaws movie, Steven Spielberg directed it. It made his career, effectively invented the expectations of the modern blockbuster movie. Spielberg didn't want to make the second film. Universal did. And so it brought in Jeannot Schwartz to take that on. And as much as that was a difficult production that I will come to in a future episode, that made money at a point where sequels were not a thing. Jaws 2 was made, was a success. And so Universal was kind of interested in exploring where else it could go with the series. I mean, the sequel point's really important because this was not even the era where Police Academy films had nailed down the idea of repeating the plot of the same film over and over and releasing them on an annual basis. Sequels were very much the exception, very much looked down on, and they weren't even expected to make the same kind of money as the original film. They were, you pop them in the photocopier, you take a bit of cash, you pay for a nice Christmas party. But it came as a surprise even then, though. Not that there was a third Jaws film after the second one had done well, but in April 1979, the announcement from Universal, which had just it was in the midst of success with National Lampoon's Animal House, was that it was bringing in the National Lampoon team to do a Jaws film. Now, Animal House had been a gigantic hit in 1978 and a hugely profitable one, and Jaws was Universal's best franchise. I mean, it wasn't franchise cinema at this point. So crossing the two over was years before Sony tried to cross over Men in Black and Jump Street movies, unsuccessfully, I should know. But even so, that was a bit of a read in the newspaper WTF moment. I mean, do you really want to cross the streams on these? But it sort of did. And so Universal hired the National Lampoon team to direct a fourth wall smashing parody movie under the Jaws name. The working title was Jaws 3 People Nil, and it had the producers of the original Jaws film, Richard Zanuck and David Brown, on board with the idea. And so amongst the writers for National Lampoon at that point was John Hughes, long before he would hit pay dirt with the likes of The Breakfast Club and his iconic range of 80s movies. At the time, he was in Chicago on the outskirts of the film business. He was writing for National Lampoon and becoming an editor there. But it was turned over to John Hughes and Todd Carroll to write the screenplay for Jaws 3 People Nil. And this got really quite far down the road, that they produce a script based on a story that was conceived by Matty Simmons, and Simmons has talked to IGN about this in an interview you can still find online. And the studio was going to gamble on it. In fact, by the middle of 1979, Roger Bumpass was reported to be starring in the film. Bo Derrick's name was linked with it. But in the background, there were still concerns because Universal wanted a PG-rated movie for a broader audience. The National Lampoon team, well, it wanted an R-rated movie, which was more the Animal House audience. And ultimately, the failure of reconciling just where the audience was what collapsed this particular iteration of the story. Now, that didn't mean various scripts were not written, because they were. And in fact, Joe Dante would be hired to direct at one point, and he tells a story on the late Gilbert Gottfried's podcast about watching people cut up bits of scripts and pasting various bits of scripts together. Amongst the bits in there was, it was so fourth wall breaking that there was basically a film about the making of a third Jaws film that would pull the leg of its director to the point where the shark would keep attacking the director of the film, would bite off his foot and then his toe. Joe Dante came in off the back of the successful water-based movie Piranha, and Piranha itself was a spoof of Jaws that Steven Spielberg had intervened in to stop Universal Pictures taking an injunction out of to stop its release. Piranha was coming out the same summer as Jaws 2, and Universal saw Piranha for what it was, a straight rip-off of Jaws, and wanted it stopped. Spielberg caught a screening of it and quite liked it and said, no, you should let this one go. Spielberg had the power, Universal ceded to him. Dante then in turn lands the Jaws 3 gig, at least for a while, and it could start crewing up. In fact, a couple of $1 million was spent on pre-production at this stage. Bo Derrick got to the point of being signed up for the movie. Richard Dreyfuss was agreeing to appear in it, and so some of the original cast were being tapped up to appear in cameos as well. And it got to a point where the head of Universal Pictures at the time, Sid Sheinberg, was also going to appear in a cameo role as himself about the making of the movie, that they go to the studio head at one point, and there is the actual studio head. So an abundance of, a couple of stories for why this hit the wall. I mean, the tonal line clearly was a major issue, that what the film Universal wanted, the film the National Lampoon wanted, were very, very different. The other story, and it's Matty Simmons who told IGN this particular one, was that Steven Spielberg got wind of which way this was going and was not happy. And so he allegedly walked into the office of Universal boss Sid Sheinberg and said, if you're going to make this, I'm walking away from Universal. Given that he delivered E.T. for Universal, there's no question who held the power dynamic there. And so that's one story why Universal reportedly walked away. But I mean, the definite is Universal definitely buckled, and it backed out of Jaws 3 People Nil. And when it did so, a bunch of people went with it. So David Brown and Richard Zanuck would take their production, would go off, leave Universal, would move to Fox. Matty Simmons walked away from the film. Joe Dante, meanwhile, I mean, he was great grateful to be released from the project, which was not fun behind the scenes, as he told Gilbert Gottfried, and he instead took the opportunity to leap onto another project that was having tonal problems, The Howling, and that would be a pivotal movie in his career that would lead to him, what do you know, working with Steven Spielberg on the likes of the Twilight Zone movie and Gremlins and a few others. So, I mean, the long and short of this particular guise of Jaws 3 was by October 1979, the experiment was at an end, that the comedy parody version of the film wasn't happening. But Universal was still interested in getting a film moving because exhibitors around the world, not necessarily in America, but certainly internationally, were asking it, can we have a third film? I mean, this is easy money. That's the theory. And so instead what Universal did, rather than making the film itself, and imagine this now, it allowed the rights to be picked up by another party to make it, Alan Landsberg Productions. Now, Alan Landsberg as a producer was a television producer, really. Cinema was not his game, but he got the deal. He sealed a deal in 1980 to make a third Jaws film for Universal, and he quickly got a script moving from Gordon Trueblood, who put together a 41 page treatment for which direction the movie should go. Now, Trueblood wasn't the only one working on a script. The famed sci-fi writer Richard Matheson was also working on one as well. But the crucial thing here was Universal agreed to this way forward. It wanted the film quickly. It wanted to sell it overseas. There was talk as well about 3D. Why not try that? And we'll come back to that shortly. But basically, the creators behind the first film, in particular the second film as well, their creative footprint on the third movie, let's just charitably say, would be diminished. But Landsberg wanted to get this moving as quickly as Universal did, and so haste was required. Now, Trueblood's treatment for which way he thought the story should go at one stage had two different sharks in the same film. That was ultimately vetoed. I mean, the logistics of getting one shark moving in a Jaws film were infamously troublesome. So the idea of having two, well, that was just a non-starter in the end. He scouted out a couple of directors. Murray Lerner was one who was sounded out about directing. Not a feature director, but had worked in documentary a lot. Certainly had experience, but he looked at what was on paper and just declined. In fact, he would never, across his career in the end, make a non-documentary feature film in his extensive body at work. And so instead what Landsberg decided to do was look closer to the franchise. So Joe Alves had designed Bruce the Shark on the original film. And at one stage during the very, very, very troubled production of Jaws 2, he was one of the candidates to step in and take over as director. This time, he was going to step in as director. And while that conversation was going on and Joe Alves was being tempted with making his directorial debut and mooting the 3D idea again, well, as Horrified magazine reported in an excellent piece online, there was another alternate script option coming through from Richard Matheson. Now, Universal wasn't entirely keen on it. It wanted Matheson to find space, for instance, for a role for Mickey Rooney in the film. Matheson duly rewrote his script, put in a character for Mickey Rooney. What do you know? Mickey Rooney then wasn't available, and so, the more rewriting had to take place. But Matheson walked away. He'd done his work, and it was Trueblood who then had to knit together the final script. Then in came Carl Gottlieb, who came in to do rewrite work and punch together the movie, really. And it would be Gottlieb and Matheson who took screenplay credit in the end. It's worth noting in the midst of all of this, another director was possibly put forward. That Variety reporting Mel Stewart of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory fame was set to be directing in August 1981. At that point, the film was going by the name of Jaws 1982. Not a fat lot of good, given that the film came out in 1983. Or Jaws 3, but Mel Stewart, for whatever reason, didn't work out, and it would be Joe Alves who stepped into the director's chair. Roy Scheider, he was sounded out about coming back for the film, but let's just say he was politely vociferous in declining the role. And so this idea of making the film about the Brody brothers, building on characters from the first film or two, that was the way forward, really. And in came John Putch in his feature film acting debut, and a young Dennis Quaid also landed one of the lead roles. In came Louis Gossett Jr., in came Leah Thompson, and by August 1982 came the report that the film was going to be released in 3D, that there was a mini 3D boom going on in cinemas at this point, primarily off the back of horror cinema. I mean, Friday the 13th had a bit of success. That was the thinking. And also, John Landis had been talking at Universal of doing a 3D kind of monstery movie, and Universal felt maybe that would be right for Jaws. And so the idea of a 3D Jaws movie came forth. Overseas exhibitors loved that. That's another gimmick that you could sell off the back of. They weren't going to be shy of selling off the back of it, as you can hear from the teaser trailer, and in an era where such teaser trailers were rare. And so in October 1982, filming could duly begin on Jaws 3 with a healthy budget as well, $15 to $18 million, depending which source you go with. And just to put that into some context, I mean, Gremlins was made like a year or so later, and that cost less money to make. The credited directors at the point Variety announced the start of production also included Michael Caine, not that one, spelt with a Kane, although he's not credited on screen anywhere in the end. And so, I mean, over to Joe Alves, really, who in an interview with Sci-Fi Wire was explaining just what a horrible film this was to make. He said, I came up with the idea of making it 3D, and so then I got the directing job, but then I realised they didn't have any new cameras. They were all old. So we had to make cameras, we had to get the convergence right, and I had this television producer, Alan Landsberg, that was got to do it quick. And so Alves would reflect, it was extremely difficult in the technology, just shooting it, because the convergence wouldn't be right. We'd have to check it. And it was very, very difficult. And it wasn't the only thing that was difficult as well, because the practical making of the film, well, it caused, I mean, at one stage, it ends up going, spoiler alert, to a SeaWorld resort. And they needed some flexibility in how they shot all of this. And they needed an underwater tank that could ideally hold 1.6 million gallons of water. But they didn't have one in the US that they could use, so they had to build the underwater tank for this. It would become, for a while, the largest of its type in the US. Then they filled it with water, and then they saw all the impurities in the water when it was filled up, made the water dirty, and it looked awful on screen. Then they paid for a posh filtration system, and that didn't particularly work. And in the end, I mean, it took a couple of attempts just to make the water clean enough in that tank for them to be able to use it for filming. It was a big production that involved thousands of local people as extras as well. And it had this quite ambitious plot line. And also, I mean, it had this shark at the heart of it. And the shark had been problematic in the past. But Roy Arbogast came in and he was in charge, and he built the shark for Jaws 3, basically on top of the construction that they used in Jaws 2. And they'd made it bigger and better, and they'd improved it. But still, it was a fractious production, this. And Arbogast would quit the film on the final day of filming. He wouldn't return for Jaws: The Revenge, and there was some acrimony between him and the studio over exactly what had happened. On the human side as well, I mean, Dennis Quaid, I don't want to go tabloidy, just to say he's been open about his battles with addiction in the past, and they were evident during the shooting of this. He was married, and also there was a relationship outside of that with one of his co-stars. All sorts of these things that were just adding friction as well, while they were also battling this new three-dimensional camera system that they developed for the picture, that they were using only one camera to do it with a split lens, and all of it was kind of pushing at things really, and trying to get things that hadn't necessarily been done to work. Now, the filming took place primarily in the Florida area. It used SeaWorld resources as well. And the movie went into post-production, but I mean, this too would be a slight problem, really, because as Joe Alves would tell Sci-Fi Wire, he cut the film in the end to a certain length, as had happened with the previous two, but he didn't have final cut of the movie. That in then came producer Alan Landsberg, again, not a cinema expert. His background was television, and he cut 20 further minutes out of the movie, which was centered on the personal relationships with the film. And he was pulling back a lot of the character stuff to arrive at this 98-minute feature film. And so, I mean, it was a theme park ride they were ultimately selling. That was what they were going to push it off the the back of. It wasn't off the story. It wasn't off the back of. It wasn't off the back of things they wanted to do to extend the franchise. They were selling a 3D version of it. Quaid, incidentally, would give an interview. I mean, I touched on it there. Quaid would ultimately give an interview where he talked about how he was high right on drugs. I think he said in every frame in which he appears in the film. But still, that wasn't known at the time. What was known was that Amityville 3D was a 1983 release that was taking advantage of the 3D boom. Friday the 13th Part 3 had basically enjoyed success off the back of it. And so the 3D was in place. The film was in place. They were ready to sell it. They were pushing it. And the marketing was, I mean, really, really quite heavy on this one. I mean, I remember in 1993 when Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park came round that here in the UK we were on British television. There was a half-hour making of the kind of thing that's a DVD extra now. If we still had DVDs, they seem to be going as well, sadly. But they got to that idea early here that there was a special making of Jaws 3D Sharks Don't Die promo documentary put together, and Universal persuaded television stations in the US to broadcast this, and it was also broadcast elsewhere in the world as well. And that was giving basically free primetime advertising for the Jaws movie, which, along with the blanket marketing and the heavy release that was planned, the tie-in trading cards, I mean, they were really pushing. It led to an opening weekend of some note for Universal. It's just like, it's easy to look at films like Jaws 2 and Jaws 3 and just assume, well, they didn't do particularly well. They did. You know, this opened to not great reviews at all. I mean, but again, not massively hostile ones, that the gimmick had some carry to it, although critics were kind of saying this has fallen a long, long, long way from the original Jaws film, and also it had fallen a fair bit from Jaws 2 as well. But, you know, 90 minutes, not too bad. You know, bit of a fairground ride, decent fun. $13.4 million it opened with, July the 22nd to the 24th, 1983. Now, $13.4 million in July 1983 money as a box office opening weekend was a tremendous result. You know, this was the kind of era where it took a long time to build up that kind of cash. You look at the films that were around it was up against as well. I mean, there was competition. I mean, Return of the Jedi was in third place. That had been around for 9 weeks. I mean, films could play for that amount of time. Flashdance had been in the top 10 for 15 weeks as well, and it accrued $65 million. It had taken 15 weeks to get there, and that was regarded as a huge surprise hit. Superman 3, that was in 9th place. The James Bond movie Octopussy. Staying Alive was the 2nd place movie. Class had opened in 4th. Trading Places was about. War Games was about. There was a lot to see, actually. But Jaws 3D had done tremendous business, but also the following week when Krull opened, what a film, and National Lampoon's Vacation, it was one of the first to have a sizable blockbuster drop-off in its second weekend box office. That as the word of mouth started to spread that this might not be as good as the original Jaws, spoiler, sorry, its box office fell by 45%. Again, that wasn't as commonplace then. But then Jaws 3 started to tumble. And so in America, I mean, it fell for the next few weeks and would gross $45 million at the US box office. But again, that's a pretty good result, really. Once you tally in the money from overseas as well, Jaws 3D was a hit. $88 million worldwide at a point where that was the kind of money that made movie studios very happy. And so, result, happy. They were going to look at doing a 4th Jaws film, which they ultimately did, and I will come to that some way down the line in a future episode of the podcast. But Jaws 3D's timing wasn't perfect. It's worth noting that the 3D novelty after a year was already starting to burn out again. In fact, it wouldn't really resurrect until James Cameron decided, oh, let's have a look at that many, many years later. But still, there was just enough in the tank for 3D for it still to work. But I mean, reflecting on the film, Richard Matheson gave an interview on this, and he just said, if they'd done it right and it had been directed by somebody who knew how to direct, he said, I think it would have been an excellent movie. And he said, Jaws 3D was the only thing Joe Alves ever directed. The man is a very skilled production designer, but as a director, no. And I would direct you to the interview that Alves did with Sci-Fi Wire, where he very much puts his side of the story and what he was having to juggle to get this film over the line. That said, if anyone ever decides to resurrect the Jaws franchise, I want them to properly do that parody and not in a kind of epic movie kind of way. The script is actually out there online for Jaws 3, People Nil. In fact, there are a couple of variants floating around. It wasn't the one that we got made. Perhaps in hindsight, it probably should have been the one we did get made, but still, Jaws 3D, it's quite good fun. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time and thank you for your support. If I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod on Twitter as well. On Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. And then our websites, filmstories.co.uk is where you'll find every weekday updated news, reviews, features, just film stuff really. We love talking about films, so we talk about them a lot there. And then if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can buy all of our print magazines and our Sneakers Blu-rays available in the UK as well, with fresh extras that we put together for that. And that's all available there. But as I head towards the last regular episode of Film Stories before I take a short break for the summer, I just want to, again, thank you for your time and for listening. Main thing, as always, is you all look after yourselves. You all take care. I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. You be safe in the water. Take care. Bye-bye.